And now, for a session presented by Hotel Connections, please welcome the President of Hotel Connections and Travelliance, Mike Appleton, in conversation with Skift Research Editor, Jeremy Kressman.
Hi, everyone. Mike, thank you for joining us today at Skift Aviation Forum. I think I want to start with some context, right? I'd like to tell you or just give you my understanding of what Hotel Connections and Travelliance is. As I understand, you guys manage a lot of travel and scheduling and logistical details for airline flight crews. Can you explain in your own words what Hotel Connections and Travelliance does and why this is such a big challenge for airlines?
Sure, Jeremy, and thanks for having me. So ultimately what happens is once the schedulers break apart pairings and make any changes, it causes a lot of changes to what is the puzzle that ultimately has to be the end result. And so when you have something like a storm or any sort of IROP situation, it's difficult to communicate to what we call three-headed monster. So number one, you have to communicate to the transportation provider because they have to know who they're going to pick up, where they're going to pick them up, when they're going to pick them up. Mm-hmm. Number two, you have to communicate with the hotel because ultimately they have to know who is going to be arriving or potentially canceling. And then three, which is the most important, is the crew members. So what we have done is we've built a mobile app and a suite of products that automates the entire workflow, both on the crew side and as well on the distressed passenger side.
You use this term IROPS, and I know we've got a very insider audience today, but can you just give everyone an explanation of what that acronym means?
Yeah, sorry, I guess jargon from the industry, so thanks for the clarity. But ultimately, IROPS is the irregular operations, and that is when something doesn't go as planned. So if you think of a scheduled operation, which, that's what we like, plane leaves at 2 o'clock and it lands at 5 o'clock. However, storms happen, people have delays for certain reasons, there's mechanicals, whatever it is. And in that situation, you still have a rooming need or a transportation need, but it may not be originally at the time you thought or in the location that you thought. And it's so critical that we communicate effectively and immediately with the crews, the transportation, and the hotels in real time, because we're trying to minimize the amount of time that crews are staying on curbs and put them into hotels as quick as possible.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. So, Mike, airlines are famously complex. They handle all of these functions inside of their businesses, like route planning, fleet management, ticket pricing, revenue management. How do you think about this question of, okay, we do all these complex functions already inside our business. Why should we have a partner like Hotel Connections handle something like flight crew logistics? Tell me about your thinking on that.
Yeah, so the interesting fact is they do a fantastic job, and we're not really looking to displace what they're doing, but there's a lot of people involved between them and then obviously the transportation and the hotel. So what we ultimately are is a logistical technology company that's putting that all together, so that ultimately when the scheduler makes a change, no one has to pick up the phone, call transportation, see where transportation is, then call a hotel, see if they have availability. That workflow automatically happens, and we have a system that does that. Not only that, has some AI and automation behind it, so nobody's touching it, and it's actually doing predictive analytics to understand where that scheduler is going to need something, so we're ahead of the curve. So what we're ultimately trying to do is give the best crew experience, minimize the time, and then to do it for the most cost-effective way, right? So ultimately, our value prop is that we can do it significantly less when you look at total cost of ownership, which I think we'll get into later.
Sure. Well, so maybe you could take us through the process of how a flight crew trip is actually organized and planned. You've got all these steps like picking vendors, you're booking the trip, you're talking to the crew when they have a problem. Take us through some of the pain points there and how some of your solutions match up with that.
Yeah, so it starts up at the procurement process. So we ultimately have to secure both transportation and hotels. And we've built a proprietary tool that communicates directly with the B2B. So from us right to the revenue managers of these decision makers. So it goes in and it actually buys based on the exact pattern. So it's optimizing the pattern, because unlike a corporate traveler who checks in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and checks out at 11 a.m., that's not what our cycle is. And that's how property management systems are set up. So when we have a crew that flies in, whether it be a low cost or an international flight, they arrive at 7 in the morning. We have to have someone on the curve waiting for them. That's what our SLAs say, and that's what the airlines need. And then we also have to have a room that was blocked prior. So when we use our proprietary software, Vindo, what it ultimately does is it blocks that room and it optimizes it when it procures it based on that pattern. So if it's a 24-hour clock or a 30-hour clock, ultimately that's what it'll do. It's not going to buy the room based on 3 p.m. and an 11 a.m. checkout. And the reason that's important, number one, is operationally we need to get heads in beds as quick as possible. Mm-hmm. But two, when you look at the process at the end, the most difficult thing is what I would constantly go back to with the airlines is it's great if you can go out and optimize your contracts, but what's happening in the bargain for exchange, because it becomes very difficult to actually do the reconciliation on the invoicing. And the reason is the property management systems at the hotels aren't set up for this type of flying. So basically it becomes an honor system. So our flow actually flows all the way through directly from the CMS, the crew management system, directly through our rules engine, which takes this data that the property actually bid on in our tools, and then it pushes it out digitally to the hotel and says that's what we owe you. And then if there's any tax optimization or any sort of other cancellations, that's automatically happening through the system based on the rules that we have put, based on each individual airline's desires and rules.
Well, and certainly the simplification aspect of this is important in a year when everything has been kind of thrown out the window with operations and any kind of travel, right? Which actually brings me to my next question, which I think is about simplicity, right? Travel is ultimately this very complex business, and especially flight crew travel, right? These complex schedules. We've seen a lot of moves on the corporate travel side of the business, or the consumer side, if you will, to build these very easy to use apps. Why is it so important that we also do that behind the scenes as well? Why does it need to be easy to use for the crew?
Yeah, because ultimately they're coming just like Jeremy, when you and I get off a plane, right? You come, it's been a long day. The worst thing in the world is where you don't have a phone you can just look at and see, okay, the little driver's coming around here, right? And even worse than that, if you don't have that visibility, if it doesn't happen and you're waiting, right? And number one, you don't time out until you're into your hotel securely. But number two, it's a painful experience for them. So what we're ultimately trying to do through our crew application is give them the empowerment. They're the front of the plane, the pilots, the flight attendants, they're in control of that plane, and they should be in control once they get on the ground too. So that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is empower them with the tool in real time, where they can see the transportation, where they know which hotel they have to go. They know the amenities, and not the amenities that you and I look at if it has pool or bar. The amenities that have been negotiated for them, if it's discounted food, if it's discounted laundry, if it's free Wi-Fi. They have that all at a touch of the button, and then we can turn features on and off based on the airline preference, like buybacks, for example, where if a crew member is going to their home and it doesn't happen to be their bases, they're not going to use the hotel room, where they can sell it back basically to the airline. So if the airline was going to pay $100 for the room, the airline can decide, okay, we'll give them $20 as long as it doesn't have any tax implications. And the system does all that in real time. And so it really gives them a very, very pleasant experience.
Well, you mentioned this aspect of real time as, plans change, someone goes home instead of going to a hotel. I'm curious how that ties into what you mentioned before, Mike, about this concept of data, right? We hear a lot about artificial intelligence. Lots of companies, whether it's airlines or otherwise, are using this technology. How is that helping manage this complexity? And what does it offer an airline to have you using this, this tool at their disposal? How does it help?
Yeah, so ultimately, when I first talked about the total cost of ownership, is if you just look at like apples and oranges, sometimes we'll get some pushback saying, well, our rates are X. And it's like, I don't really, that's irrelevant to what your total cost of ownership or your total spend is. And so what the tool does is it ultimately looks at what the total cost will be if you procure the room. So yeah, you have rate as one piece of it, but you also have the contract optimization. If you're paying 2 rooms instead of 1, it guarantees that you're getting that. Number 2, obviously there's staffing associated with it when you have these flows. And anytime you have manual processes, it just, at least I can say this, we aren't fantastic at them. We haven't found anyone, that really is, because there's always going to be a drop ball as long as things are manual. So we're automating those processes, including cancellations, where there's tremendous amount of spend in that piece, as well as the tax optimization to ensure that you're getting all the tax optimization, because the airlines shouldn't be paying for rooms on scheduled rooms. And sometimes they should be actually buying rooms in order to save money, as well as no-shows, as well as buybacks, as I previously explained, and then international currency exchange. So if you have like-for-like currencies, if you're flying overseas and you want to be able to use the same currency, we have capabilities, and we have a credit card, actually a virtual credit card embedded right in the platform. So there is no fraud, so that we're getting that like-for-like currency. There is no fees associated with it. And then the final is the bargain for exchange, that invoice accuracy. No one else is doing the reverse invoice. I assure you that, airline doesn't want to spend their time or their resources. It has taken us over 21 years really to perfect what we have. We're able to actually automate the stay and then reverse invoice it, where the hotels literally can just click a button, say they accept it, or if they don't accept it, they show us the challenge. But our SLA with the airlines is once we hand it to you, we guarantee that it's absolutely 100% correct, or we'll pay the difference.
Mike, tell us a little bit about the results of using this type of service. What sort of financial benefits or other types of benefits, for that matter, are you seeing with clients from using Hotel Connections as a partner?
Sure, thanks. So typically you're going to talk about somewhere between 15 and 25% savings off their total accommodations and transportation spend. Could be higher, could be lower. Ultimately, the way that we get to it is we have a bunch of data analysts. They come in, they look at your actual invoices. So they try to reconcile what actually happened. Did you get the bargain for exchange? And then we model out exactly what it would look like under us. And that's probably the range. I would say the average around 20% reduction in spend. And on top of that, the other massive benefit is you can make data-driven decisions in real time. You could see who's on first, what's on second, and you can say, okay, this is going to cost me X. Or if I decide to do, this property as opposed to this property, we're telling you what total cost of ownership, because the hotels have a little bit of complications in them in that they charge early check-in, late checkout, they charge caps, they charge different by, you could be in the same zip code, different tax district, same thing on transportation, one provides it, one doesn't. So what we're ultimately doing is empowering the airlines to make decisions. We don't look to make decisions for anyone. We're just giving them the tools to make the decision that's right for their crews.
Okay. We actually had an audience question, which I'd love to ask if we have a minute here.
Perfect.
How important is it for Hotel Connections and the service you offer to exist with what's going on this year with COVID-19, right? We've seen so many disruptions to the airline business where carriers are flying. Make the case of how you're helping deal with what's happening now with COVID-19.
Yeah, and we did a great white paper. I'd love to share it with anyone that's interested on what our three-step approach was back in March. But ultimately, because we have this procurement tool that we built and it directly connects with the hotels, we knew that airlines needed savings immediately. But not only do they need savings, they needed a safe environment for their crews, which was the most important thing at that point. And so what we were able to do is we were able to turn over literally thousands of markets for airlines in minutes, basically pumping this out to the market saying, hey, we need COVID rates. And at that point, nobody really knew what was going on. We had some visibility because we have a heavy presence in Asia, and we started to see what was happening there. And, once we started to see it in Europe, where we have a heavy presence as well, it started to, it was pattern recognition that we said, we really need to get ahead of this. So initially what we did is went out to the markets, started saying we need 30-40% reduction of the total spend, not of the rate. And we also need extension of payment terms, for example, for many of our clients that were looking at, some cash flow, and they just wanted to focus on that. So we were able to do that, not by picking up the phone, not renegotiating, and everything's embedded directly into the system from the beginning to the contracting phase. As we started to see this prolong, let's say call it through the end of March, that's when we went into phase two, where we're going to go to the end of the year and then ultimately look to secure these savings for 5 to 6 years. However, that's only a piece of the puzzle on the savings and then be able to operationally. You also had a ton of, I would say, movement in the hotels, because you had in some markets 30-40% of the hotels that closed their doors, or they were no longer adequate because there was some other situations, whether it was civil unrest or political unrest in cities, that it wasn't adequate for our crews to stay. So we were able to transition and move that, let the airlines focus on what they needed to focus on, and we were able to pick that up really seamlessly.
Mike, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today at Skift Aviation Forum. And let me just say, you have an excellent background. Be well.
Thanks, Jeremy. Have a great day. Come visit us in Miami.